Hello, everyone. Welcome to the People's AI Summit. I'm Dr. Stephanie Hare, and I'm a broadcaster, author, and researcher focused on technology ethics. Thank you to the citizens and their many partners for organizing this conversation today. And I'd also like to thank all of the speakers who we're going to be hearing from in just a moment. They all have arranged their schedules to make this happen, and we're very grateful. So this week in Bletchley Park, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak will be hosting the AI Safety Summit. Today, at the White House, President Biden is unveiling a new executive order on artificial intelligence. So it's safe to say that this is an inflection point for AI. It's a moment where leaders and various interests are jostling to set the rules of engagement for this technology. And that's why we are here as well for a People's Summit and to share critical perspectives on artificial intelligence. So first of all, before we get started, a bit of housekeeping. If you are watching across any of the various platforms where this conversation is taking place, you can chime in and share your thoughts with the hashtag #PeoplesAI. For the media, we will be throwing out questions on a rolling basis. Please let us know in the chat if you have a question and if it's for the group or a particular person. Furthermore, we're going to share some important research and set some context. So the first is, this morning in Byline Times, researchers and journalist Florence Wildeblood and Manasa Narayanan have a stunning investigation. We're going to put the link in the chat that shows the sweeping cronyism and conflicts of interest in the UK's newly formed Frontier AI Task Force. That's driving the summit that's happening this week, and it's entrenched with big tech money and connections. The report shows that the ties that the task force members have to leading private sector AI companies is essentially a revolving door. Task force members leaving tech companies for a task force are expected to provide oversight for those same companies. Secondly, there's a white paper from the Real Facebook Oversight Board and the citizens, that's Meta and AI, clear and present dangers that threaten democracy, economic security, and privacy. That outlines the many harms from AI and digitally altered content from just the last quarter alone on Meta's platforms. So when Nick Clegg comes to Bletchley Park and Mark Zuckerberg goes to the White House to shape the future of AI, this report shows that what's on Meta's platforms right now, today, is discriminatory content, deep fakes, AI-generated election disinformation, and it's all over their platforms. So that's a thing that's happening. Now, we are here today in parts to make it clear that AI's risks are not in the future alone. They are very much happening right now in the present. As Maria Ressa, who couldn't be with us here today, but has weighed in on the summit, has said, democracy itself may not survive 2024. We need real AI safety now. So on that cheerful note, onto our conversation. We're here to talk about three things. One, what's happening now across all these platforms. Two, why the Prime Minister's summit is such a missed opportunity and misguided effort to address the harms of AI. And finally, third, what we can do about it. So we've assembled a great group of speakers across different sectors from different perspectives to share what they see as the most urgent and the most important considerations that we should be giving right now to AI safety. I'm going to introduce them one by one. Again, remember that hashtag #PeoplesAI, no apostrophe, that's the hashtag that you can use, and the media can ask questions throughout. So just send them in and we'll process them. So our first speaker is Deb Raji. Deb is a computer scientist and activist who works on algorithmic bias, AI accountability, and algorithmic auditing. Deb has worked with the Algorithmic Justice League, Google's ethical AI team, and been a research fellow at the Partnership on AI and AI Now Institute at New York University. She's a current Mozilla fellow, and she's pursuing a PhD at University of California, Berkeley. Deb, over to you.
Hi, I'm happy to be here. I agree, it's been a very hectic week. for all of us working on AI and AI policy related topics. So yeah, I think a lot of what I hope to, so I will actually be at the AI Summit later this week and looking forward to that. We'll also be participating in the AI Fringe effort by various folks sort of hoping to operationalize expectations around safety and especially around evaluation and auditing. My concern or my main issue or that I advocate for in these groups is effectively to operate as a fact checker. Under the executive order, some of the corporate commitments and some of what we've heard from the AI Summit already, there is definitely an increasing awareness about the grounded risks involved with the deployment of this technology and all the ways in which, if we do not properly set guardrails around how these technologies are deployed, and particularly deployed in high stakes scenarios, there is the high probability that many individuals, and especially marginalized individuals that are misrepresented or underrepresented in the data used to train these models, will face potentially a lot of harm. At the moment, a lot of our understanding of how well these models operate in the real world is dependent on evaluations and assessments submitted by the companies themselves. So we tend to rely on what the companies are saying about how well their technology is working and what kind of risks the companies prioritize in order to be able to characterize the safety of these systems. And a lot of my work has been looking into effectively challenging the narratives coming out of these companies. Historically, with simpler AI models, so think about predictive risk assessments or facial recognition systems, we found that the companies tend to overestimate how well their technologies work. They evaluate these models on these static data benchmarks that represent a specific part of the population, but might omit the performance of that technology on perhaps marginalized folks where it tends to work not as well. Also, sometimes when the technology is assessed only internally, the scope of that evaluation is focusing on perhaps a very specific type of story around how accuracy, or a particular narrative around fairness that does not paint the complete picture of how the model behaves once it's deployed in the wild and all the ways in which it can impact marginalized folks in particular. And so a lot of what I've been advocating for has been effectively enabling third-party assessment, either by regulators or by various accountability actors, including civil society, journalists, lawyers, to be able to effectively independently assess and question the narratives coming out of these companies about how well their systems work, to broaden the scope of the concerns that we're looking at, to participate in establishing guardrails and standards, to articulate our expectations for that technology, but also to be able to go in and obtain the information that we need to critique the decisions being made, the design decisions being made about this technology, so that we can protect those that are impacted. And so a lot of my role at the summit, and I hope in this conversation, will be from that lens of assessing these systems with the goal of accountability.
Brilliant, Deb. Thank you so much. I've already got at least 6 questions for you if no one else has them later, so get ready. But first, on to our next speaker. We've got Alex Winter up next. So Alex is an actor, director, and filmmaker. His documentary, The YouTube Effect, is out now. Alex was outspoken on the role of AI in the Hollywood writers' strikes. And he also has an op-ed out this morning about the AI Summit and Big Issue. So we'll drop a link in the chat for that. But over to you, Alex.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here, and it's an honor to be amongst such genuinely expert guests who I've been following. Deb really, I think, laid out very clearly one of the most significant aspects at the heart of this. And from my perspective, I'm primarily a filmmaker and an actor, and so my concerns have been largely on 2 things. One is the impact of AI on labor, and AI, not to be glib, is kind of almost a meaningless term at this point. It refers to such an incredibly broad swath of machine learning tools and models that a lot of rhetoric gets passed around, like we heard this morning from the U.S. government. We're going to put guardrails onto AI. Well, what does that mean, right? A lot of times when people talk about actors, for instance, and how their imagery is going to be manipulated by AI, it actually has nothing to do with AI. It's really just straight computer graphics technologies that have been around for decades. And it is not about AI. It's really about labor and the relationship between corporations, tech, including tech companies, government, and the labor force, and whether that labor force is being protected or not. I see two core issues here with the UK summit, and frankly, the US and the EU's response to this rise of technologies, including technologies that are being called AI. I'd say the primary issue is that, as Deb spoke about, there are inherent biases. Those biases impact most people who really need to be protected and are not going to be protected moving forward, and are often not even spoken about in terms of the protections that are needed. We hear about these apocalyptic doomsday scenarios, and not about the fact that AI is going to be used as a cost-cutting tool to wipe out an enormous part of the global workforce. So in my work with the NEGCOMs, the negotiating committees for SAG, DGA, and WGA, my primary concern was, look, it's not just these upper middle class white folks making lots of money in the entertainment industry. It's primarily the greater workforce that's going to be hurt by these technologies. So the lack of transparency that we see from these summits, the fact that the government is absolutely in the pocket of big tech, so they do their bidding. So when they say they're putting up guardrails, they 100% mean those are guardrails that big tech allows them to put up, and that big tech itself is incentivized to cut costs, which damages the workforce, and to monetize disinformation, propaganda, and other harmful forms of these technologies. They are not incentivized to lose profits. So I'm very wary, actually, of the executive order this morning coming out of the United States. I'm going to be examining that closely, and I'm very sort of disappointed in what we're getting so far from the UK summit. And I will let the experts now go on to speak in a granular way to that. Thank you for having me.
Alex, thank you so much. I think you just articulated some really important points. It's going to be adding to our rolling list of questions. So again, don't relax. You'll be under the interrogation lamp soon enough. But our next speaker is Corey Kreider. Corey's a lawyer and co-founder of Foxglove Legal. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who cannot wait to hear what she has to say. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Stephanie, and I'll try to be brief. I want to make a passing comment about what Rishi Sunak should have done if he were really serious about AI safety in this summit, as opposed to setting up what I'm afraid is a bit of a talking shop. And then I want to talk about two balls we really need to keep our eye on if all of us are serious about AI safety, because the problem with these big tent talking shops is that they distract us from where the real problems are. First, if he were serious about safety, Rishi Sunak needed to roll deep and bring all of the UK majors regulators in tow, and he hasn't. Not a single regulator, as I understand it, is attending that summit. Where? You heard Alex talk about the workplace and the upheavals in the workplace that are coming. Where is the labor regulator looking at whether jobs are being made unsafe or redundant? We at Foxglove have spent years working for people who live in the panopticon of big tech's platforms, a fishbowl of surveillance and algorithmic optimization. So that's content moderators who train Facebook's AI, who work in appalling conditions that give them PTSD. Here at home in the UK, Amazon's warehouse workers at Coventry, again, optimized by algorithm. These robotic warehouses are literally breaking the bodies of people who work at Amazon. Multiple US regulators have investigated those warehouses, found the conditions to be a systemic health and safety risk. And again, none of those people are here. If Rishi were serious, where is the ICO? Where is the data protection regulator to deal with the fact that the whole business model of these companies and their large language models has been to scrape everything from the internet, your artwork, your writing, your face, to train their data? Instead of bringing the ICO, they've got a new data bill that would put it under more political control and disempower that regulator. And finally, we needed to see the Competition and Markets Authority here to be sure that the handful of companies who now control AI development don't end up owning us all. We all know who we're talking about here. We're talking about Google, we're talking about Meta, and we're talking about Microsoft. Are we really ready for 20 more years of a handful of tech firms dictating the terms of our economy and our society? Because I'm not. The fact that we're not going to see any of those regulators here, I think tells you everything you need to know about the summit. Now, let's not take our eye off the real ball. With these set piece events, that's the big risk. So while Rishi Sunak rabbits on about killer AI, big tech's money and their lobbyists are going to where they think the real action are. Here in the UK, that's the Digital Markets Bill. A huge amount of lobbying money right now is being spent on trying to weaken the UK's competition regulator, the Competition and Markets Authority. That's because recently the CMA has showed a little bit of spine and an intention to try and rein in some of these big companies. For the first time ever, they blocked a merger between Facebook and another tech company earlier this year. And they tried, although ultimately it wasn't very successful, to intervene in the Microsoft Activision merger. Big tech now wants to be sure this never happens again, so their lobbyists are working overtime to dilute the Digital Markets Bill and say that the CMA should have to fight all of its decisions from anew in court, and they're not satisfied with having to take a judicial review of all government actions the way you and I and other ordinary people do. They want a full retrial of everything. That's a recipe for disaster and for the regulator being outspent into oblivion. So if we are serious about AI safety, do not take your eye off the Digital Markets Bill and the government need to put it through without big tech watering it down. Finally, the other big AI development we shouldn't take our eyes off of at this moment is the potential overhauling for the systems to manage patient data in the National Health Service. Any day now, the government is going to give a £500 million contract to manage the National Health Service's health data to Palantir. This is a US spy tech firm who mainly work with the security services of the US. The new kit Palantir is supposed to run, the federated data platform, will form the largest point of access to the UK's health data that we have ever in this country seen. Now that's a big deal. The NHS is sitting on what some people say is the most valuable trove of health data in the world. One consulting firm put the value at maybe 10 billion a year. This is happening at the same time as Rishi Sunak, Steve Barclay, and the rest have announced that they want to deregulate protections for health data and make the UK the most innovation and AI-friendly model in the world. On the BBC yesterday, the CEO of Palantir, Alex Karb, said something very important. He admitted that this new system, the FDP, would make it easier for government to open up commercial access to our health records. Now, he insisted Palantir don't want to access or sell data, and I'm not quarreling with what he said, but he did admit that it makes the government more able to do so itself. So again, the question is, do we trust these officials at this moment to keep our health records safe from, for example, commercial exploitation to which nobody has consented? AI in healthcare can do a lot of good working with radiologists, but it can also do a lot of damage to patient trust if people think that their health records are commercially accessible in ways that they weren't asked about and don't have any control over. So again, if we're serious about AI safety, we need to make sure that when we develop mass data systems for patient data, we don't do so out ahead of the public and by running roughshod over patient choice. I'm conscious of my time, so I'll stop there.
I wish you hadn't stopped there because that was an absolute tour de force. I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone when I say that, but we'll hopefully get to ask you some more questions to reflect. Thank you for that. Our next speaker, just to keep the time, reminding you, of course, that it's #PeoplesAI, no apostrophe in that if you want to put things on social media. Our next speaker is Karsten Jung. Karsten's a senior economist at IPPR, a progressive policy think tank. He leads the work on macroeconomics and structural economic reform, and he's the author of an important paper out last week, linked to in the chat, Artificial Intelligence for Public Value Creation, introducing 3 policy pillars for the UK AI Summit. Karsten, over to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me. So I'll summarize a bit what our paper out last week, what it called for. And it's basically 3 points. So first of all, there's a lot of talk about immediate risks from AI with regards to the AI Summit. But the matter of fact is, and others before me have said this on this panel, that we're helplessly behind in terms of our regulatory capacity to actually track those risks. So, you know, this includes things that the government talks about, like cybersecurity, but also things like biased decision-making, consumer deception, and misinformation, which we know are all really big risks right now. And we're largely relying on a company's self-regulation and companies giving high-level reports of how they're managing these risks. Now, if you compare this to finance, I used to work in financial regulation. We regulate risks very differently. So we say we have systemically important banks, for example, that pose a risk to the economy, and here we have established big supervisors that can ask pretty much anything to banks to check whether they're managing their risks. And we are arguing that we need similar supervisory powers for really tracking what's going on inside these frontier AI and risky AI companies. And we need those supervisory powers. Secondly, we need to do more to address structural harms. So, for example, in the 2010s, we made the mistake of, again, relying on self-regulation and not being on it with regards to competition regulation. And we have this huge increase in market dominance by a small number of players. And we are already seeing similar dynamics in the AI space with OpenAI having 60% of the Gen AI market share. And the risk is that the first mover advantage will turn into entrenched market dominance. And in the UK, this means, one, we need a strong digital markets competition and consumers bill, which is currently at risk of being watered down. But also we need new tools that help make sure that companies that are first movers don't exploit their market dominance and squeeze out smaller firms. So we need much more forward-looking competition policy. And finally, and I'll close with this, is we're talking a lot about risks and structural harms, but what is completely absent from current discussions is actually a positive vision for what we want AI to be used for. So we're arguing we need a much more public purpose in the policy discussion. So, for example, as we do with climate, where we're incentivizing the deployment of renewables, we're incentivizing certain types of technologies like EVs being deployed. We need a similar thinking, an industrial strategy thinking for AI as well. What are actually the big problems we want AI to solve? And both in terms of scientific breakthroughs, but also in terms of helping government, helping better government delivery of public services, and solving societal problems. We need more incentives, such as we have in industrial strategy, like subsidies and regulations, to incentivize AI for public value creation. And I'll stop there.
Again, I wish you didn't have to stop there. That was brilliant. And I read your paper last week, and congratulations. It's wonderful. So if anyone hasn't read it, worth reading if you've got a long flight or something the next couple of days. So our next speaker, just because I want to move us forward, is Sasha Konstanza-Chok, who is a researcher and designer who works to support community-led processes that build shared power, dismantle the matrix of domination, and advance ecological survival. Sasha is presently associate professor at Northeastern University, a faculty associate with the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and a member of the steering committee of the Design Justice Network. And had a fabulous book out just a few years ago, which I read and loved. So over to you, Sasha.
Thanks so much, Steph. Thanks for having me. It's just been a pleasure to hear everyone's, key points on this. I agree with everything that's been said. I'm going to make 3 points with my time. First, we have to shift the overall focus from risk to harm. Second, we need to use existing legal and regulatory tools now that we already have access to, even while we develop new tools. And third, we need to put public AI infrastructure on the agenda. So first, shifting the focus from risk to harm. So we really need to shift the public conversation about what's happening here from AI safety and AI risk, even talking about high risk now, and whether it's existential or not, to thinking about AI harms. Because so-called AI, which is a marketing term for the bucket of technologies that includes automated decision systems, large language models, generative tools, predictive policing, military intelligence, other forms of automated carcerality, and a lot more, are harming people right now every day. So we need to reveal these harms. We need to stop them. We need to repair the harms that have already been done. And depending on the context, in some cases, we need to fix the broken systems that are harming people to minimize the harm or shut them down when necessary. So the headline isn't AI might kill us all someday. The headline is people and institutions are using AI right now to cause a wide range of harms. We have to stop them and repair those. And there's a bonus here, which is that fixing real present day harms happens to also be the best approach to mitigating any long-term risks of future harm. So the Real Facebook Oversight Board's harms report work that was launched today is a great example of what harm reports might look like as applied to a specific platform. That kind of work has to be multiplied. So we have third-party harm reports about every AI system, especially the high-risk ones. And governments and multilateral bodies have a role to play here, perhaps in supporting shared infrastructure for AI harm reporting, just as we have developed in the cybersecurity space. Second, using existing legal and regulatory tools now, even while we develop new instruments, right? So don't be fooled by the industry PR that the current law is wholly inadequate. It's absolutely not the case. We need to consider the tools that we can apply at each layer of the AI stack right now. So for example, a lot of AI systems are built upon data that's been gathered without consent or compensation. And we can attack that kind of practice using data privacy and protection law and using copyright law. And in fact, this is happening currently. There are many active lawsuits in that space. Also, many deployed AI systems have discriminatory outcomes that can be targeted with anti-discrimination law, sector by sector. For example, in the United States, Facebook housing ads allowed racial discrimination in the way that they targeted ads that violated the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, and so they were sued on that basis. We should see more of that. Some AI companies offer services that can be targeted by anti-monopoly or fair competition law, as Karsten was just talking about. And in the US, we have some powerful remedies, like the Federal Trade Commission has an algorithmic disgorgement ruling potential where companies are forced to destroy any non-consensually gathered data and the models that were built with them. And I'm less familiar with the UK regulatory space, but if algorithmic disgorgement isn't available yet as a tool, it should be become available. And if it hasn't been used or is being used infrequently, it should be used more actively. And third and finally, we really need to put public AI infrastructure on the agenda. So far, we've been talking about ways to mitigate harm and to rein in the worst abuses, but we're still all just assuming that this entire space has to continue to be dominated by large multinational for-profit private firms. And we need to shift away from that. We have to shift the narrative that private for-profit companies are the only possible and rightful owners of AI systems that are transforming all of our lives and the ways that we work. So, for example, generative AI systems are trained on vast data sets of centuries of human creative and intellectual work. So they should belong to the commons and to all humanity, not to a handful of powerful for-profit companies. So we have to think about how do we do that? What would it mean to rebuild or to build public AI systems from the ground up? And so you have to think about every level of the construction of an AI system. So for example, we'd have to have consented data gathering practices and validated consented data sets that they could be trained upon. We would need mandatory open source licensing for any AI systems that receive public money, whether that's at the R&D stage or in procurement policy. So when a company is contracted by a municipal government or a federal government or international organization to provide a service, the procurement policy can require mandatory open source licensing, or at least privilege firms to have that. We have to invest in the development of open source software development tools and frameworks that aren't owned by individual companies. We need to talk about fair labor standards for workers across the AI value chain, in particular the workers who are responsible for reviewing and tagging harmful content created by generative AI. There's a lot of ways to advance that, including government procurement, research grant requirements, and supporting unionization. So for example, there are unions of AI workers already forming, like in Kenya, where more than 150 workers whose labor underpins AI systems used by Facebook, TikTok, and ChatGPT recently organized the African Content Moderators Union. So ultimately, public ownership of AI systems would enable us to ensure that the benefits and harms are more equitably distributed and that any profits would be placed under public control. Thanks.
Thank you, Sasha. That was incredible. We've got two more speakers, one of whom is still getting a bit settled. So I would like to invite Gail and her to be our penultimate speaker. 3 minutes again, if you can. She is a filmmaker and producer. She produced The YouTube Effect by Alex Winter, which is out now. Ooh, and she also wrote the screenplay for The Terminator. Gail, please expand on both of those things if you would like to have an extra minute, because I think we're all dying to know.
First of all, I am speaking as a total layperson, probably the greatest representative of the public here, but also perhaps the person who's been worried most about AI for the longest period of time. In 1982, Jim Cameron, who, by the way, deserves the greatest amount of credit for conceiving of the Terminator, and I created a project that imagined a future with unregulated AI and out of control biotech. Now, the problem with that doomsday scenario is that it's been used as a way to get the public and regulators and, it's a dodge for large companies who are controlling the space to avoid the regulation that everyone here is talking about, because they instead focus on out of control cyborgs, the war against the machines. And as many of the speakers have said, we are dealing with harms right now. And it will be very, very difficult to prevent additional harms or to compensate people who have already been harmed. The interesting thing is we named the nightclub in the film where Sarah Connor first encounters the Terminator Tech Noir, because we thought that there was a genre, a subgenre that should imagine the dark side of technology. So we're at this pivotal moment in time when the future of our planet and humankind lies in the balance. As I said, not necessarily from killer robots, but the decisions we make now will determine whether our future is a bright one or a bleak one. A few themes inform many of my projects. One is that we all have choices as individuals, as governments, and as corporations. And all of us can have a powerful impact. Another that plays out over and over again is that corporations are not designed to make what you and I might call the right decisions. In fact, they are designed to maximize shareholder value and must choose profitability over any type of corporate responsibility in absolutely everything they do. It's far too easy to blame artificial intelligence as a menace without directing our concerns toward the people and systems that create and guide it. What and by whom is AI being tasked with accomplishing? Do we want to use machine learning to enhance our lives without destroying 1 out of every 4 jobs? Do we want a livable planet and medical innovations to improve our health? AI can do that, but we must put essential regulatory and enforcement guardrails in place. And I don't see that anyone, anywhere, including having listened to the executive briefing this morning from the White House, talking about funds for enforcement and what that will look like. Equally important, any legislation to rein it in must be carefully crafted to avoid unintended consequences. I don't know about you, but I certainly don't want to become a serf in a techno-feudalist, uninhabitable world.
I mean, I think you speak for all of us there. Also, don't want that. We've got the opportunity to start having the press asking some questions because we've got our last speaker just settling in, so we'll loop her back in, do not worry. But one of the things that I would like to ask everyone on this panel taking speaker's privilege first is the extent to which you're following the progress of the EU AI Act, as well as the Rishi Sunak summit, and now this White House executive order. The United Nations has just come up with its advisory panel. We've got the G7 recommendations. There's a lot going on, But I guess what I'd like to ask and take advantage of, given that we're a transatlantic audience here, is which one do you think is going to most empower citizens and consumers? Which one is going to make companies actually pay attention and listen? And I guess I'd love to hear from Corey in particular as a lawyer. I'd like to know who can get sued using which one. Can you get sued for violating an executive order, or can you get sued for not obeying the EU AI Act? So that's a lawyer question for you. But second, just how much all of you are aware of what's happening in Europe and if you're following it, or do you take more of your stuff from English language, Anglo-Saxon sort of stuff? So over to you, anyone who wants to answer that first.
May I give a very short and I hope not too glib response, which is I sometimes shock my friends in the human rights community by saying that I prefer laws with cops, which is not, by the way, to say that I love cops, but what I mean is a regulatory regime is meaningless without the tools and power to enforce it. And so that's why I couldn't agree more with Sasha that what we need to look at are the tools that we already have and the regulatory agencies that we already have. Let us not assume that because we are calling it artificial intelligence, that it is some unicorn to which the laws that we already have, which they want to believe were written on vellum and could never apply to them, don't apply. They do. These are not unicorns. These are corporations, and they are subject to health and safety, antitrust, data protection, labor, and other laws, just like any other corporation. So let us, yes, update the laws where we find gaps in them, but let us look at the laws that we have and apply them. So I hate to give such a glib answer, but my honest opinion is that we need to work with the statutes that we have and the regulators that we have to enforce the law as against these corporations.
Thank you for that. And just while we have you, do you have a view on the EU AI Act? Is that something that people should be paying attention to in the US or not so much?
I'd rather somebody else weigh in, if I'm honest. I prefer, I think at the moment, you see the most promising action out of nation states. I wish it weren't true, but I think that the most promising action is out of, let's say, federal regulators or national regulators. That's my honest opinion.
Okay. I see some nodding heads there. Does anyone else want to weigh in? Yeah.
I'll just say quickly from the U.S. side that we've been following the EU very closely because they've been the most vocal. And they've put forth the most amount of sort of concrete attempts at regulation. I will only add that I sort of highly echo what Corey just said, and also what Sasha was speaking to. I think a lot of this, sadly, is performative, and it's very easy to make big statements. And I think it beyond being performative. It can actually be dangerous. Some of this regulation, including regulation coming out of the EU, will actually make things harder for sort of marginalized groups and the labor force and people who need protection, and more protective for big tech. I think some of that's inadvertent and some of that's intentional. So the FTC here in the US, again, though, I would say there's I think genuine legitimate interest in being effective there, but I'm still suspicious of how much actual legitimate action they will take. I'm sort of most encouraged by the ability to sue organizations and individuals for specific harms. These are real world harms. Some of these aren't related to AI at all. They're related to business practices and monetization issues. And so we're getting a lot of propaganda and a lot of distraction, diversionary tactics. And so I think the more people suing on the grounds of legitimate harms, the more action will be taken. But I'd also add summits like this where people get to get much more granular understanding of the issues, the idea of tech literacy, media literacy, law literacy. I think if the public is better armed with real information, then it's easier for them to fight.
Deb, thank you, Alex.
Yes, +1 to everything Alex and Corey just said. I definitely agree that the current existing laws are more than enough for us to start seeing some traction, especially like Alex mentioned, with respect to the corporate practices, which are really at the heart of a lot of the tangible issues to workers' rights and some of the harms that Sasha mentioned around data protection and privacy. Something I did want to flag was that you mentioned the EU AI Act, and I feel like at the international level, a lot of what we can practically hope for at that level is probably a high-level guidance or standards. So, there's some work out of OECD. Now the UN General Assembly has an AI advisory committee. There's a lot of the sort of high-level guidance around how to think about AI regulation will probably be coordinated at the international level from a very practical level, like ISO standards and IEEE standards, which a lot of the national agencies, so for example, in the healthcare space, like the FDA, will look at those international standards in order to set and articulate their expectations for the technology nationally. And to Corey's point, in terms of enforcement and around like enforceable laws, that's going to really happen at the national level. So there is a relationship between some of these more high-level international conversations and the way things are going to play out nationally, and the kind of laws the national states are going to be in a position to enforce. So I don't think the international conversations are pure pure hot air, and it is important even at that higher level for the conversation to be guided in the right direction. So for example, one hazard that I see with Sundark's summit is, I think Corey mentioned some of this, which is that there's a lot of focus on, far out existential risk, but also a very myopic focus on generative AI and sort of this new wave of AI technology with, ChatGPT and some of the chatbots and the, image generation models. And as Alex mentioned, and I think Sasha mentioned this as well, that's just the latest iteration of what we're calling AI. AI is a broad category that encompasses several technologies. I'm really happy Sasha also mentioned, the public infrastructure element of it. A lot of governments use various types of risk assessments and, various technologies for a plethora of current use cases affecting millions of individuals. And, I think someone also mentioned online platforms and recommendation systems. So the scope of what we could be talking about is a lot broader than what Sundark is mentioning at this summit. And I think some of what has been achieved by the framing of the summit being so narrow has been sort of the international conversation around standards and some of these high-level guidances, narrowing in on some of these definitions. So for example, the use of frontier AI or foundation models has really become popular even within nation states that feel like they should be focusing on that because that's what the international focus seems to be. And so I do think that there are ways in which that international conversation does trickle down, and we should be even at that international level, I'm hoping to see more diversity in terms of the views and the types of conversations we're having. I think there is certain interventions that should be happening at that level. And then speaking specifically about the EU AI Act, I think that's one example of a space where, they came in with that act very focused on, recommendation system, online platforms, facial recognition, risk assessments, and now they're adjusting it to accommodate or address generative AI, again, because of the way that international conversation has shifted. And so, the whole space is so fast moving and evolving that we have to be really careful about the scope of things that we're looking at and how we're framing everything. I really love, to go back to the earlier points that were made, I really love the point around we're dealing with companies. Ultimately, we have an existing framework around, both international governments and national enforcement around, corporate regulation, whether it's regarding antitrust or labor practices. And a lot of these companies feel like they're sort of too big to fail or that they're above the law in this respect. And so that's one easy dimension that could be brought into that international conversation in a way that we currently don't see. I'm actually glad that in the executive order, because of a lot of advocacy on the ground, we saw a little bit of that language in there, but more of that type of participation from civil society and from sort of those representing the impacted population, or those that are part of the impacted population, again, will bring color to these higher level conversations, and hopefully trickle down into the conversations happening at the nation states, and that will lead to legislation or guidances such as the executive order that actually will enable enforcement, either at the agency level, through the executive branch, or through, like, Alex mentioned, litigation and other forms.
That's brilliant, Deb. Thank you so much. That was such a thorough answer. I feel like we can all write analysis just from that alone. But while you were speaking, I was aware that there's something that we haven't discussed in this conversation, and I'd love to add and build on to what you just said and invite everyone else to reflect as well. And this is a question also from our journalists who are listening, which is, what are the most worrying developments in AI for journalism, social media, and of course, elections, which is something that we haven't touched on yet. So if we can all turn our brains to that topic for just a moment, maybe starting with journalism, just to honor our journalist colleagues who are with us, but also really thinking about the elections coming up and what we're going to do now, because of, it's not just 2016 rerun, we've got some new problems. So who would like to be our first person to tackle that? Any volunteers?
Okay,
I can jump in quickly. Oh, no, I'll let Sasha do that.
No, go for it. I'll follow you.
Just very quickly, because we've been immersed in research around, specifically around the monetization of disinformation, with the project that Gail and I have been working on, and we've been doing summits all over the world around the rise of disinformation. It is very difficult to tackle any of this when there is an incentive on the part of big tech to disseminate this type of propaganda. And there's also incentive on the part of big tech to reduce the number of journalism outlets and journalists, because they monetize propagating that information themselves. So that has been a battle that we've been fighting, honestly, for a very long time. And some of that has nothing to do with AI and everything to do with business practices and the capture of the public's attention by these big tech platforms at the expense of legitimate news organizations. So, once again, whatever they want to say about their lack of ability to content moderate, they absolutely can moderate better than they do. In America, YouTube was doing a very good job of keeping Stop the Steal information off of the platform until they made a conscious decision to stop keeping that media off the platform. And so they undid their own content moderation as we head into an election cycle, because they make money off of this type of content. And so disinformation is being monetized. And so they're not incentivized to stop doing that. That's what I got.
And Sasha, would you like to build on that?
Yeah, I'll just build up. I absolutely agree with that. And I think that it kind of points to the need for us to have a conversation about the underlying incentive structures in news and information circulation. It takes us a little bit afield of the tightly bounded conversation around the scope of AI regulation, but we do need to have a much broader conversation around a return to public media models. We have handed over the keys of the information kingdom to a handful of multinational technology platforms that see themselves as not responsible for what's published on their contents and on their platforms, and in fact profit heavily from the circulation of disinformation. So there's one set of responses to that, which is to require them to invest more resources in content moderation, which means hiring more people as well as deploying better partially automated tools. But ultimately, that's kind of an arms race. So I think that we need to be thinking about public media options and what it will mean to take seriously the idea that we need to make public investments in information and news infrastructure. Again, not allowing the discourse that an entire sector of the economy that's quite important, which is information production and distribution, just naturally belongs in the hands of for-profit private companies. We need to shift that. And the other point I wanted to make which is relevant to this piece of the conversation as well as to the, Deb's key points around, an overemphasis on the generative AI conversation, I think is it's important, and it's also a little bit distracting from some of the key harms that are happening to people on a daily basis in terms of automated decision making that cuts people off or provides access to resources of many kinds, whether it be housing, healthcare, and so on and so forth. Is that the firms that are selling tools that nation states are using and municipalities are using to make automated decisions around resource allocation are operating transnationally, and they are operating in the global majority. There's a fantastic report called NotMy.ai by Coding Rights and collaborators about the deployment of automated decision systems across Latin America, including in the public health system, including in predictive policing systems. And so we really need to think about how these companies that are headquartered in the global majority countries, in the US, in the EU, in the UK, are doing business all around the world, and local regulators and activists, perhaps we need to build stronger coalitions and support and learn from them as well in terms of some of the legal actions that people have been able to take to try and rein in the most harmful system deployments, in the global south. So we need sort of transnational solidarity between lawyers and activists to rein in the worst impacts, in particular in less resource countries where some of the worst outcomes are being seen.
Thank you, Sasha, for adding on to that. And I've got another question that might be tough. Gail, I saw that your hand is raised, so if you want to say anything, go for it. I'm just going to ask this question first, just so that people can start thinking. So this is the next question from our journalist audience. In analyzing tech companies' own safety assessments and test results, what kind of information is being withheld? And what should third-party auditors, researchers, and specifically be asking for? So how can we help them to do their job?
I'm going to start with mentioning the elephant in the room when it comes to journalism and media, is that there are many politicians in the United States and throughout the world who benefit from misinformation and disinformation. And in fact, they want the propaganda to be at their control. And as a result of that, there is not a great deal of incentive to make sure that disinformation is regulated in any way whatsoever, or even identified as such. And to the point where researchers probably on this Zoom are aware that there has been a movement afoot in the United States to actually ban any further funding into disinformation and misinformation at NGOs and universities. So that's truly frightening to me. And the second question was, what was it again, the topic? Because I had a comment on that.
Yes, it's how can we help our journalist colleagues in terms of what information they should be asking for,
yes,
etc. So really specific.
Yes. So what concerned me with the executive directive this morning was that there is transparency requested just between tech companies and the government. As we know, there's a revolving door often between the tech companies and government and the people who serve on those committees. And there is nothing in it that guarantees that researchers and NGOs and think tanks that are nonpartisan will get in any information whatsoever. And I think that is not transparency at all. And I think we need to be very concerned about that and push very hard to make sure that that data is shared with the people who don't have any kind of financial stake in it.
Thank you. Karsten, I'm going to come to you in just a second. I just want to say for the journalists who are listening on the call that the European Union's Digital Services Act has a provision that will force big tech platforms to share data with external researchers. So the exact wording of that law is being finalized now. Tech companies are obviously pushing back on that because they don't want that. So again, don't just look in the US context, look over in Europe too, because you might get your angle that way. Karsten, over to you, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. I thought this was a really great question, and the example from the EU is really relevant here. And two other examples are the AI companies in the way or in the run-up to the UK summit have released their AI safety approaches. I have made what I think is being called a disclosure on their safety methods. The UK government has also said it wants its frontier task force to have access to companies' AI models. And I'd argue exactly as the question points to, the devil is absolutely in the detail. Currently, the disclosures we've seen are incredibly high level about what testing is being done, what risks are being thought about. But really, if these are the types of disclosures the public gets, we can't really say much at all about what's going on. And one thing we've argued for is that actually to really understand where risks are evolving, say misinformation risks, you need actual really detailed access by supervisors to usage data. So for instance, with regards to the leading AI models, the public and regulators are completely in the dark with regards to what it's being used for. We don't know how much GPT-4 is being used for generating real-looking news articles, but that are ultimately misinformation. We don't know how much it is being used for cyber-related activities, creating cyber risks. And really, to judge what the risks are to society, you need supervisors to have this kind of access. And again, and I close with this, in other domains, we have created this access, right? We know we have financial regulators that know very well where banks are investing, where risks are piling up, how these risks are being managed. So the public has some kind of oversight, including via Parliament, that knows what these supervisors are doing into where the risks are. And just relying on high-level statements by governments that say we've thought about this, that's just not good enough.
That's true. And you just raised a really interesting point that reminds me of some of the work we've seen about not knowing the energy and water requirements of data centers, particularly those involving generative AI. So the companies know, so we can either get the information from them, but we could potentially be talking to water suppliers, electricity suppliers. We need to find out if the energy that they're using is dirty energy or clean energy. None of that's being covered in any of the proposed regulations I've seen. So we may have to get quite creative for the investigative journalists out there about how we're going to get this information to the public so that we can make better decisions. But I'm delighted because we have at last our last speaker joining us, which is Professor Sophia Noble, author of Algorithmic Oppression, a MacArthur Genius Award winner and a complete hero of mine, and I'm sure many people on this call. So she now has her 3 minutes and can also ask, potentially reflecting on some questions that we've had, but don't feel obliged. It can also be for the group. Professor Noble, Alex Winter mentioned some of the details around biases before you joined the call, but it was largely this question of bias and discrimination. We want to know if we're talking about historic biases that we have seen in recruitment, in housing, and in classic ways of discrimination, or if there are new biases that are happening as a result of AI. So is it new AI bias, or is this just the same old thing with AI weaponizing it? But also, we just want to hear what you have to say. So you have your 3 minutes now. Thank you.
Good day. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I think, to cut straight to the chase, there's no question that the biases of the past, structural racism, discrimination, are deeply embedded into the kinds of systems that we're seeing. I mean, the latest study that I saw showed more than 50% of the kinds of answers that ChatGPT, for example, gives on questions are patently false. I can tell you from my own research, just in the launching of that tool into the marketplace, that product, that when you ask it questions about race and racism, about people, you get a lot of answers that would not be the kinds of answers that are appropriate or responsible, and that are not based in fact or reality. So I think part of the challenge here is that not only do we have a disproportionate amount of truth and reality that gets operationalized here into these systems, as Dr. Costanza Shock has said, racist hallucinations, which I think is quite appropriate. But they are anthropomorphized in a way that the people interact with these kinds of systems and actually think that the best ideas are coming through and that the best knowledge is kind of curated, and that there's some type of more magical and more reliable kind of thinking than human beings or that experts could provide. And so that we know is just patently false too. So, what happens when we're talking about all of these kinds of historic, discriminatory kinds of experiences, human endeavors, from genocides that are kind of actively and historically happening in the world, to masking our inability to have a humane response and use knowledge in a way that actually brings about peace and justice in the world. We are also in systems that generate propaganda and then also spit that out and do that in an automated way. So that, these are systems that we really have no idea for the long haul, the kinds of harm. But I can tell you from the bedrock kinds of tools like search engines, which is something that I've studied for a long time, we know that courts and lawyers use the things, judges use the things that they find in these systems and operate on them as if they are real. We are seeing medical providers who are using these systems to provide certain kinds of information for their patients. That seems incredibly dangerous and harmful. No kind of ability to check the veracity of these things. So we could go on, and I'm sure that many of my colleagues here today have given very important examples and evidence. There's just an overwhelming mountain of evidence here. I think the bigger question now before us is, why do we have public officials who lack the moral character and courage to confront these companies and their leadership and hold them accountable? We're talking about maybe 1,000 people on planet Earth who are making decisions that will affect billions of people. And the only people who can truly keep them in check or create consequences severe enough for their immoral products and activities that are truly about profits before people at all costs are regulators and policymakers. So this is their moment right now, that they have got to stand up on behalf of the billions of people who cannot, in fact, be in the room to create the pressure. And to me, that's the whole world is watching right now what these governments are doing, and in fact, what they're not doing. And I think that the consequences are so severe that we just can't ignore it. This is well, we're ringing the alarm today because we see that the kinds of people who already have been accused of crimes, quite frankly, crimes against humanity, who have participated in the building of products and the incredible profits that they have garnered from them, are the people sitting in the room influencing and writing the rules. If that is not the world turned upside down, I don't know what is.
I'm wondering, therefore, this is our last question, but for everybody to reflect on, so feel free. If one of the most important fixes you might recommend to ensure real AI safety is about the different types of people we need to have in the conversation and not those 1,000 power players that you alluded to. And we see that here in the United Kingdom with our AI Safety Summit. There's been a lot of controversy about who's been invited and who hasn't been invited. Then there's the whole thing of how do we get, we've got the US, we've got the EU, we've got the UK doing stuff. China is obviously doing its own thing on AI regulation. And then there's sort of the rest of the world. How do we make sure that there's a seat at the table for all of them? So I'd be really curious if everyone wants to just offer a reflection, and then we'll close on what you think is the one thing, if you could just fix one thing. I know it's not silver bullet time, but still 5% change is better than zero. The one thing that you would like to see to improve AI safety, or how we think about AI, even if you don't think AI safety is the right call, what would it be? Feel free to just jump in as you do, and slightly tight if you can, just so we can give our journalists time to go off and do what they need to do.
Well, while my mic is hot, I'll just quickly say that I think the most safe thing we could do around this is hold companies and their shareholders, their boards of directors, criminally liable for the harmful products that they design.
I would 100% echo that. I just think that there is for me, that's twofold. That's accountability on the part of government and on the part of big tech, but it's also literacy for the public. There's so much disinformation, obfuscation out there. So I think that, and people like the experts that are on this panel who are doing incredible work, but getting the general public to understand these tools and the world in which they live before they are on the receiving end of those harms.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I would agree 1,000% with the idea that we have to hold these companies liable for the crimes that are committed with the tools that they develop and deploy, whether those crimes produce smaller scale harms like representational harms, disinformation, misrepresentation of people, whether they produce misallocation of resources and unjust denial of access to benefits for people, whether they produce physical or lethal harm, like the AI that's been incorporated into Israeli target tracking systems in so-called defense towers in the West Bank. So across the entire spectrum, we have to hold these companies accountable. And I also think we need to go further and think about changing the narrative so that we don't always assume that private companies have the right to steal the data and knowledge that's been produced collectively by humanity, privatize that commons and turn it into a profit-making enterprise. And we need to think about what would it mean to place these tools and technologies in the hands of the public.
Thank you, Sasha.
I think transparency is incredibly important. And I think we can't enforce, we can't litigate unless there's a great deal more transparency. So I think these need to go hand in hand.
Gail, well, we've got you here. I wonder if you have a thought on this, but also given your incredible screenwriting track record of shaping culture with The Terminator, do you think that there's a sort of story that needs to be told about AI that isn't being told, be it through cinema, television, whatever, that will get people thinking in the ways that we've just explored here?
I do think that's absolutely essential, because it's important for people to understand through fictional characters they can identify with what these harms are, what these concerns are, and realize that that there might possibly be solutions. Once again, I think I've always tried to tell stories about ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, and sadly, that's all of us right now in this current age. I can't say that I have the story in mind, but I think it's one that needs to be told, and the sooner the better.
Thank you. Karsten, I want to make sure you get the last word, and then I'm going to say goodbye.
Oh, sorry, I didn't want the last word, but yeah, just to say, if we're really serious about AI risks, I think we really need to look at the specific laws that are being put in place, not just high-level commitments. So, like the UK Digital Markets Bill, getting that through without being watered down will be unbelievably key. And then for really tackling risk, we need. It's maybe a less another flashy point you made, but we need very well-resourced supervisors. We can have the best intentions and the best principles, but unless we have the public sector infrastructure to police the risks, we're just at the mercy of self-assessment of these dominant corporations. And this was the mistake we made in the 2010s when we left digital markets to self-regulate. So this time around, we really need to up the public infrastructure to properly police the risks.
Well, that's quite a to-do list that we've all got. So everyone skedaddle and go fix it now. I'm just kidding. This is going to be the work, I suspect, of an entire generation. So I wish you all strength and courage as you do it, lots of self-care. Thank you so much to our brilliant speakers for making the time to share their knowledge and expertise and thoughts. We will be sharing this on all of our different channels. So what have we got? We've got a press release that's going to be coming out. We're going to be looking at all of the links that are here. Everything's going to be on the website. So there's going to be a chance to share this recording. I hope that you will, so that other people can benefit from this conversation as much as we all have. Other than that, it just remains to say thank you very much. And I wish you a good rest of your day. Thanks.